Hello, this is Michael Clemens with the new Extel podcast. We are very fortunate today to have Tracy Gopal join us, who has joined us over the many years under Institutional Investor and II Research Speaker Series. We are speaking with her today about the Japan Board Diversity Network that she's founded. Tracy has over 25 years of corporate finance and corporate governance experience, advising business strategy, transactions, investor engagement, ESG, board composition, and really is a Japanophile. I mean, I always think that you're here and I'm back in San Francisco where you are because you're always in our time zone. But thank you for joining today.
No, thank you very much. And I am in San Francisco, but my heart is in Japan. How's that?
Yes. Yes. And even though today's a podcast, your background is Japanese screen. So even your background is Japanese. So can you start off by sharing with us your personal journey? Like what has inspired you to get involved, especially in board governance and particularly in Japan?
Sure. So, as you noted, I have been fascinated, passionate about Japan for about 35 years. I'm a 1992 jet, and I started studying Japanese in 1988. On a side note, my son just started studying Japanese in high school.
Oh, wow.
30, so many years later. So this is absolutely my life passion is to be affiliated and associated with Japan. From the corporate governance angle, I worked at ISS, as you know, Institutional Shareholder Services. And prior to that, I was in investment banking. But I find corporate governance absolutely fascinating. And I was extremely aligned with former Prime Minister Abe's third arrow for economic reform, focusing on bringing investment back to Japan. I'm a CFA charter holder as well. And so watching the markets lag for 3 decades was very disappointing. I'm obviously very happy to see the recent market upticks, and I'm, you know, quite optimistic. And my company, is Third Arrow Strategies, which was named after Prime Minister Abe's policies. But in 2021, I started the Japan Board Diversity Network. We started with, 21 charter members. And through this network, I believe we can have a huge impact on both corporate governance and diversity throughout Japan. And my ultimate goal was to use my passion and my skills to and my superpowers, connection, inspiration, passion, and education for good to really support Japan in moving forward into the next few decades.
So when we think about the current landscape, for example, um, what what does the current landscape look like for women on corporate boards? I know this comes up a lot, and I know that with regards to governance, it's having a diverse board for its many meanings. It's brought up more and more. But what do you feel is the current landscape right now for women on corporate boards?
Well, from the landscape, I basically just looked at some statistics that were pulled by, I think Engagement Square, report by Sumitomo, that looked at, and it looks like about 95% of these prime boards now have, one or more female directors, and about 50% have two female directors. So if we consider that back in 2014, 10 years ago, there were like next to no external directors to begin with. And now we have these statistics. I think Japan's progress on adding women to the board has probably been even more rapid than the changes made in the UK or the changes made in the United States. I mean, our changes, I'm in the United States, they easily took a decade. And, notwithstanding, Norway's, automatic, 40% quota where things changed quite rapidly. I think Japan has had an actual more rapid progression in terms of adding women to the boards.
Hmm. And what do you feel are the significant trends or changes that you've observed recently with regards to
Sure.
that?
Right. So I both work with companies to place women on board. So I can talk about the trends in what companies are seeking and in skills matrices. So from that perspective, I would say that there is a deeper focus on management skills. And I think that was a result of the changes in the corporate governance code, that required prime companies to have skills matrices. And so now that the companies are required to look at a skills matrix, they're starting to think more deeply, like, what do I actually need? And they can't just follow their traditional pursuits of the lawyers and the accountants and the professors, who, by the way, are still wonderful and incredible, adding value in Japan. But I've seen the trend from the company recruitment angle for the companies that really care about governance to go towards more management skills. However, beyond just the recruitment that I've done, I've looked at probably 1,000 skills matrices. I've looked at all the foreigners on boards. I've looked at all the skills on boards. I've looked at so much data from all the JPX filings. And I've also spoken to, I don't know, 500 or 1,000 women. So I've seen other trends in the boards are actually going younger, surprisingly younger in some cases. And a lot of times in doing searches, a lot of companies do say we'd like somebody around 50, or I've actually seen people in their 30s, and I've actually received outreach from people in their 30s, younger 30s. I'd like to be on a board. So I've seen a little bit of a shift to the younger age. I've seen women as a third trend. I've seen women holding multiple positions.
Mm.
Okay, so these are women who are an executive officer or have a senior leadership role. And while being an executive officer, they are also serving on a board.
Mm.
And I can give my positive and negative thoughts related to that. One is that you learn when you're serving two positions, you actually learn how to be a better officer because when you're acting as a board director, you know what's needed for the board. And then I also do see challenges with women sometimes stretching themselves very thin. But there's
Mm.
these excellent women who manage to juggle, multiple roles while also raising families. And I have one more trend for you, and this is a smaller trend, but I wish it was a bigger trend, is that there is a greater acceptance of women who reside in foreign locations, both Japanese and non-Japanese. And after the pandemic, when people started to realize we can have meetings over Zoom, and with the new technology that is exploding, allowing so much more quick, translation of documents, and realizing that we can break down language barriers, I've seen some very positive and
Mm.
inspirational hires overseas. And I'll just give you a few examples. So Mika Nishimura, who is with Hoya, she's also on NASDAQ board. She's an excellent director, takes extensive education, not only with JBDN, but through other governance organizations. I understand Hoya even has a budget for that. But she's in San Francisco. You've got Mikiko Horie also in Singapore. She's
Mm.
on a board. I believe it might be Arisawa. Amy Hata is in New York. And these are just excellent women with skills for Japan. From the non-Japanese side, I recently had the chance to speak with, Luann Marie Pendy, just appointed to Olympus. She's a former CEO, right?
Mm.
With
Mm.
the industry expertise, governance expertise, just investor engagement experience expertise. And as you may know, the Olympus board was already set up for different languages. They've got Value Act in there. They've got multiple foreigners on the board. So that may have been easier for them than other Japanese companies seeking their first foreign woman.
Mm.
But she resides in Florida. She's retired. She's got time to travel to Japan. When she can't travel to Japan, she can do Zoom.
Sure.
And translation also works. And somebody I frequently, mention, Brenda Harvey's on the board of Nissan, also an IBM executive. And Lisa, I could give you a list. I mean, there are a list of companies, even smaller company, Lisa Hammett, just put on Sun Corporation. She was there at the original AI, quantum computing. If you want to talk about skills, a skills-based hire, she was also the board chair of Intellisat, right? So like this company that was open to global happened to get this phenomenal woman. And I look at the larger companies and I think, oh my goodness, you should all be looking to hire, yes, Japanese women in Japan, yes, Japanese women overseas, and yes, foreign women as well. So yes, not yes, not or. It's
Yeah.
and there's room for three women on the board. but that's probably the trend that may not be as, I think it's a small trend and I want it to grow bigger.
Yeah, because I think, the question of whether there is a large enough pool of candidates for the boards, you've answered it, quite clearly. There's more than enough candidates and very qualified candidates. It's not just a box checking exercise, so to speak. So oftentimes in the past, you'd seen people that had gone for a one on the board who happened to be a foreigner, and they kind of felt like they checked two boxes. But the reality is, needless to say, there's a richness of experience. And so when we have these highly qualified women joining the board, how do you feel, what is the impact of this diversity? How do you feel having this gender diversity is impacting the decision-making process on the boards with them part of it?
Okay, so there's two different categories we were talking about. So we were just talking about the global women on the board.
Right,
So I don't know, perhaps I'll answer the question of just in general, the women who are appointed to the board. And of
right,
course, everything that is ever said in any podcast has to be a generalization.
sure.
Of course, not everything applies to everybody. Women and men are different. There are some, there is a difference there. So I do not want to group women into a one category because everyone is different. But first, if we want to talk about, the stories we used to talk about are the first woman on the board, right? Once the first woman is on the board, just the atmosphere, Funiki, right? Like it changes somehow the men, the men are more aware. The women are known to do study groups more, really prepare. And of course, Japanese men also prepare. But I feel like the overall dynamic in a room just changes.
Mm,
So that's number one. And what else changes and is what ideally changes is that the topics of discussion change and the solutions change. Women may ask more questions. If, again, depending on the woman, they may ask more questions. I used to hear stories that, the men had to protect the wa, right? They had, well, yeah. So they had to protect the harmony because they were like in the in group. But the women who came from outside, they were mostly coming from foreign companies and had their own businesses. So they could speak up more. But again, large generalizations, many different types. But I think just putting a woman on the board has the first level of impact, which is they may bring up diversity more, they may bring up topics of risk more and safety. They may have different answers to solutions because they've simply had different experiences being a woman. When we add the second and third woman and we get to that tipping point, that is when women start to really have a bigger impact because their voices get amplified and their voices get heard. So just putting the one, and I think that's the phase where we are now. I think most of the prime companies have their first woman. But as you and I have actually talked about, Michael, and actually, as I think I saw Yamaji-san make a quote about, while the top companies are really focusing on governance, what about the other ones? What about the
right.
other 1,000 or 2,000 companies that are in Japan? And I think that was something that you had brought up that I later saw quoted that we need to bring the overall level of governance on. But then in terms of, so the impact, of course, it takes time. With one woman, you have a certain impact. When you get to three, then the voices become amplified and heard.
So, in addition to the kind of cultural shift or attitude shift on the board, what about with regards to business performance? Do you have examples or studies on by having women on the board, how the company can perform better?
Okay. So, Michael, we really shouldn't be discussing this at this point. This was a discussion from 2020. So
Right.
no, I'm because and no, and I appreciate that you bring up the question now because in case there are people that are not on board, I will point them to the NASDAQ filing with the SEC. But these are the discussions that I started having, in 2019, presenting at CFA, presenting at II, and all of the different presentations about performance. they're all the studies are summarized in that NASDAQ filing. So you may recall that a few years ago, NASDAQ decided to add a rule for NASDAQ listed companies about gender diversity or other forms of diversity, which also do apply to foreign companies, slightly different. But that several hundred-page document had a dozen pages summarizing all of the studies that talk about performance. And while research is mixed, I think the general consensus is that diversity is either, flat to positive. But now, putting aside the research and going back to common sense, I will also say that I asked the question probably 6 or 7 years ago to Kenta Takamori. I laid, who was with Goldman, and then I asked, I talked with Dave Richards again, well before JBDN, and David Richards at Morgan Stanley. And these are people that looked at me like I was like well behind, like how can you be asking me this question? Like, I work at Morgan Stanley. I know who our leaders are. I know if we eliminate half of the talent pool, that we wouldn't have as effective a business or leaders. And the same, Kenta was working at Goldman, alongside Kathy. So that whole firm, joined the movement about the importance of, diversity at every level on boards. So I will just stop there. And well, actually, I won't stop there. I'll go into like, how can you even expect to retain or even attract and retain talent if you
Mm,
don't have a significantly diverse board? What
sure.
are your staff going, what are your employees going to think if they look at the board that's all men, which again, most boards are not all men, but that one woman now has a unique role in Japan. Typically, the women in Japan on boards wear two hats. They have to be both an excellent board director and they also have to be promote diversity. I mean, that's just a given. And I've worked with women who I've placed on boards and with the companies, and they write into the job description quarterly meetings with our female members. And
Mm,
because they are women, they are there now to inspire the other women on the boards. So there's so many reasons that it just makes sense. I mean, these are blind spots. Women have, so now I actually will stop there on that point.
So I think that, that kind of dovetails on leadership styles. I'm not sure, for example, traditional boards say, let's have quarterly meetings with junior people in general to get their feedback, et cetera. So I think, from a leadership standpoint, the style of senior women executives are conscious of their upbringing, so to speak, in the corporate world and why it's necessary to kind of embrace that and cultivate that
Right.
for the new staff.
Yeah. And Michael, I mean, almost, I've got a membership now of several hundred women, and almost all of these women, whether they were CEOs, like Makiko Eda, who was like CEO of Intel, and now she's doing DEI at Sumitomo as an executive officer while on the board of Tokyo Electron, right? Almost every woman, I'll just also throw out Mie Kitano. She's on the board of Shimazu in Osaka, also leading ACCJ's, DEI initiative. I mean, she was super involved in diversity and inclusion as part of her role. Most of my members were like the first to establish the women's network in their firms. And again, Mia was not a DEI expert, right? She was supply chain logistics, but all of these women always did these two roles, all like almost all of them. And so it's really ingrained in so many women in Japan, not all, but most, that they want to, give back and support the next, generation. Who,
Hmm.
again, their suffering leads to the next generation benefits. So I hope the next generation really appreciates all the great work that these women, are doing because they really paved the path to make more opportunity for the women today.
Hmm. And I think everyone knows Japan, has more people. We're 65 per capita in the world and less under 15. And so with new hiring, for example, I think almost 100% of the new graduates were hired into companies because companies clearly, need to see
Right.
sustainability in their businesses, et cetera. So it really wakes up the question around how to empower many people, within the framework. I don't like to call anyone marginalized. I like to call them maximizable. And so there's so many maximizable layers, within society that people could be focused on. So, I've been to your events, JBD and events, and it's a great opportunity for me to run into people who I don't normally have a chance to meet. And so with regards to networking, et cetera, how do you feel, is the network support for women who are on boards who aspire to be on boards? I mean, frankly speaking, people in their 30s seem little bit young, but it's great that they're aspiring to be on boards at a fairly young age. I feel the same way about MBA candidates, for that matter. You want people with experience, obviously, who are bringing something to the equation in the conversation. But what do you feel with your current network, and what do you see as the future of it?
Sure. So thank you so much. Um, I think your original question was going to be about the power of a network and what it offers.
Yeah,
So, as history, I've been involved in networks my entire career.
right.
And even in 2002, oh my gosh, 22 years ago, I was the co-founder of the North Carolina chapter of the International Women in Insolvency and Restructuring Confederation.
Wow.
So
Not many
I was
people can
involved in
say that.
so, and then after that, after being involved in that organization, I actually became on the global board, and my role, chair of networks. So
Mm,
I've always been a network person. And then concurrently with that, in my former career as an investment banker and restructuring, I was also the chair of a committee of the Association of Insolvency and Restructuring Advisors, which developed a course to make all of the participants better and to really elevate the entire industry. So, networking and education has been something I have done throughout my entire career. And that's why JBDN maybe was in the cards a long time ago. But I think what networks, they inspire, they connect, they inspire, they educate. And I get emails after my events, I mean, even the last event, thank you for joining, where the comment was, it was from a CPA. And she commented, it was so wonderful to be around so many women. Usually I have I go out drinking with only my CPA friends. It was wonderful to see different people in different areas and expand, and learn so many new things. But another woman wrote an even more insightful quote. So I haven't quoted her name yet, but she was from NEC, and what she wrote me afterwards was that I believe that a situation where various types of women can play active roles has great potential for Japanese companies and the Japanese economy. In that sense, I felt the meaning of a network like JBDN, where diverse women, especially at those in the executive level, can come together in a vector aligned manner, is profound.
wow.
So, and then she told me her English wasn't that good. And I'm like, I couldn't
No,
have written a sentence that good.
no.
So in general, right? I mean, so what do we do at JBDN, right? So number one, I mean, I'm creating a market for global skills based, women to find, positions in Japan. So that's one power of the network to move the entire industry up as a whole and to advocate. But individually, it gives women the education and the tools, right? So every event we do is, here's your education, now go take action. And
Mm,
again, immediately after the last event on financial metrics, one of my women said, I asked a question right immediately at my board meeting after what I learned. So that's very powerful. And of course, I wouldn't have started a network if I didn't aspire to have impact. But the impact of my network, right? It's to bring everybody together, elevate everybody as a whole,
mm,
and thus have the impact, on the overall Japanese market.
mm. And so when you're looking at this over the next 5 to 10 years, what do you think it's going to be looking like? How much different is it going to be looking than it is today, vis-a-vis, women on boards in Japan?
Okay. So I think that, well, first we have this 2030 mandate of 30%, which seems like so far in the future. I don't know why we need to wait until 2030, but I feel like Japan will probably be similar to where the US is in 10 years. And
Mm,
that's we've got, 30% women on boards, and, roughly. And what I think the pool of talent is going to be greater, right? Because the women who are now being promoted to executive officers, we're going to have more talent. Every industry is promoting women. With the government plan is not just about boards, it's about every sector. It's about executives in industry. It's about, even the lawyer, like there's a movement among the law firms. I think the number of women in law firms might be 16% now. I mean, women partners, that whole industry is elevating. Women in accounting firms is elevating. Women professors, I see all of these colleges and universities looking for women professors, so that's going to elevate. So the talent pool, I believe, is going to be widened, in addition to Japanese boards going global, which is going to create even a larger talent pool of women. So I'm hoping, I'm hoping that we'll get to 30% without, you know, I don't think that's actually going to be hard at all. I hope the
mm,
processes are done correctly so that each board, is able to find the qualified, female candidates, of course, male candidates as well, right? We want them to elevate their male talent as well. So that's where I expect it to be, 30% more global, larger pool, more talent. And there was one thing we were going to discuss about leadership styles, which we went over. You had asked me the question about how do I see women's leadership styles differing from men, and how can we, use these benefits. And I did, I have heard and read a lot of research on this, which has been done for US boards. Right now, we don't have a large sample set of board chairs in Japan. But that's one of the things I would like to see in the future. I would like us to vastly increase the number of female chairs. I think I
mm.
might be able to count the number of female chairs on one hand, maybe a foot,
Oh, really?
but it's a low number, and most of the women who are chairs are the ones that founded their companies, right?
Right.
If
Yeah.
you founded your company, then you're the chair. But the ones that are raised up, that's what I want to see more of, female chairs, because um, not that, leadership is better. I mean, well, leadership is different. And, the general stories, right, are that women have more, I mean, and this may be stereotypes, but this is the research, right? More democratic and participative leadership. It's more transformative leadership minded, um, greater focus on risk management, and also advocacy for diversity and inclusion. So
Mm,
those are kind of the general stereotypes associated with women chairs. And I believe there's also the study that show that boards with women chairs have more women on their boards. And I
mm,
can speak anecdotally to that as well. One of my members, Deb Hazelton, former chair of AMP, she has been involved also in Japan for 50 years, is on the board of Persol. Her board, when she left AMP, was 50-50. Um, Merit Janow as well, chair of MasterCard. She's she's the chair of the Japan Society in New York as well. And the MasterCard board is both diverse in ethnicity. They even have, Monex CEO on their board. And, they've got just diversity in everything. And so
mm,
it's anecdotal, but it could also maybe make sense, because when you've got a woman leader, you're more likely to focus on, DEI issues.
mm. So I feel, your passion, despite not living in Japan, your passion from San Francisco about Japan is a unique situation where not only are you my go-to to find out, what the latest trends are, the latest information, and you kind of you're always, a great source for all these things. But, from your personal insights, what would be your advice for aspiring board members? Like, what would you give as advice to women who are aspiring to be on corporate boards or to join them?
Okay, sure. So the first thing I would say is first read the corporate governance code.
Right.
Understand what the role of the board director is. I really want people to know it's become kind of a fad in Japan to become a board director.
Yeah.
I meet many women who are like 40, they've got this amazing life and amazing full-time job, and they're like, oh, I'm so behind in not having a board role yet. And I'm like, no, you're not behind,
Mm,
So understand what the corporate governance code is, understand what the role of the board is, and really in your heart, like, you know, understand, why, but then also explore. Like, of course, I would say, join a JBDN event, or see what that's all about, or send a message and, speak to somebody who might be on a board. So find out more information. And there's
mm,
plenty of ways to find, information on being a board director. And if somebody wants to message me, of course, they can message me as well. But there's lots of avenues, talk to people if you know any board directors, and try to ask advice is really the first thing. But education is kind of before you become a board director, you want to know what that actually means, and you want to gain some skills that will help you become a board director.
mm. And you mentioned numerous people on this podcast
Yes.
who have successfully either navigated the journey to being on a board or in many cases chair of the boards, etc. But are there any other special success stories that stick out in your mind when you think about the journey, even yourself has been on in this space that you like to highlight?
There are so many success stories, and obviously I was not involved in, Deb Hazelton, who is basically has led, Australia-Japan relations for many, many decades. Um, but I personally have been involved in, even in the few years that I started doing this recruitment business, in supporting women getting on boards.
Mm,
And I can tell you several success stories. And I don't want to name too many names, but what that looks like is when the CEO comes back to me or stops by in San Francisco and says, "Oh my God, thank you so much.
oh,
The
that's nice.
ideas by so and so I
Mm,
would have never thought of in a million years." And this is one case that I'm thinking about. I mean, this is a very financial savvy CEO. And the value that was brought by this woman wasn't necessarily financial savvy at all. It was, in fact, completely the opposite. It was so many softer, like, non-financial areas. But that voice just hadn't been on that board. I've Yeah. So when companies come back and they say, "Oh, we love who you introduced us to. Can you find us a second person?" That's also a wonderful sign. And when I hear from the women who've been placed, I feel very respected. They always ask about my opinions. And there's this feeling that they're so happy to be on that board. It happens. They don't say, well, I'm okay on this board, but, I could have been on a better board or a bigger company. Pretty much 100% of the time. And it might be just that's the nature of human beings and human relationships, that once people are on a board, they truly feel like that's their family and that's the one they want. And they don't want to trade it because that's what they know. And so that's really what brings joy to my heart, is feeling people truly engaged and having meaningful impact. And then the company is also feeling gratitude for the support.
mm. And having been in Japan, for these decades, I think both of us have seen a lot. I think, needless to say, this is a really interesting space to be in because there's a long runway as far as what the future holds, etc. But what do you feel with regards to the legacy that you hope to leave in terms of gender diversification on corporate leadership and boards?
Oh gosh, I want to be too young to be thinking
Yeah,
about a legacy right
yeah.
now. So right now, I've just been given the privilege to mobilize the women who are in the positions of influence.
Mm,
And if JBDN continues and I'm able to have this amplified impact, well, actually, when I say I amplify their voices, I amplify their efforts. So
mm,
I'm just amplifying everything that all of these women are doing.
mm.
And so if my legacy is that I was able to inspire women to use their voices so that they could be more effective in making change, and that I brought joy and inspiration, and it somehow had an influence on positive influence on Japanese society, that would be really good. But I'm not aspiring for anything that impactful yet. I simply love what I do each day, and love interacting with the wonderful human beings that are in my network.
So, in conclusion, assuming the people listening to this podcast obviously are either investing in Japan, I think with the market levels where they are at the moment, all eyes are on Japan in many degrees. What would be your advice either to the investors or the investor relations teams on companies, or just in general as far as continuing to lead the conversation in the direction that you feel it needs to continue to go?
Sure. So, first to the investors, I want to say thank you because they are the source of the change of all of this movement. If it wasn't for their proxy policies and their voting and their engagement, none of this would be moving.
Mm,
In so when I'm thinking more of the voting section right now, so to those investors who are in control of policies, I would say revisit your Japan policy and see if you can elevate it, right? This minimum one woman on a board policy, again, that should have been three to 5 years ago,
right.
or 10 years ago. And so by this point, we really need to be at 20% something, not waiting for this. Well, the government says 2030, so I think we'll align with the government in 2030, and keep those discussions happening. I would also hope that they encourage companies when they meet with them to really take board composition seriously, not check the box on gender, but encourage them to ask about the process for recruitment. How are you succession planning your board going forward? What are the skills you need to have to meet your business plan? What are the biggest risks for the company? Do you have those skills covered on your board? I would really encourage them to holistically look at how to elevate the entire talent, and board functioning. And for the investors from the investment side, I would say, yay, go Japan. The goal of the third era was to attract investment back to Japan. And I want Japan to succeed. So, those of you who are choosing to invest in Japan, as we work together to unlock the value that has been recently slightly unlocked, but there's still value to unlock. And I think we have all the tailwinds to make that happen. From the company side, whether it be corporate secretaries, board leaders, or IR experts, I would say the same thing. Take your board composition seriously. Take your board education seriously. I mean, you only get 8, 10 board members. If you're a sports team, you don't just get to say, well, I'll pick 6 good board members and the other 4, if they participate, it's fine. But if they don't show up, I'm fine. You need every board director to stay competitive. So keep engaging, keep listening, to what the investors have to say, and keep the communication open. It's a two-way street. They need to hear what you have to say about your company because you know your company best. And when you spend the time to communicate, that role is really, truly so important in investor relations. So it's really bringing all the pieces together to elevate, the entire corporate governance system in Japan, which will make it so much more attractive to the global markets.
Okay. And any final messages with regards to Third Arrow Strategies or the Japan Board Diversity Network that you'd like to share? Upcoming
thank you.
events,
I thought
opportunities.
closing with the elevate the global markets together was a good closing comment. But if I was to make a final message, it would be I am open to conversations with investors. If you want to talk about your proxy policies, if you have concerns about your portfolio companies, any questions, about how to improve diverse talent, that is my expertise. I've reviewed the 1,000 filings of foreign directors. I can talk about that. And same to corporate boards. I really encourage, dialogue, and I'm happy to support companies or investors, along with women who are trying to be part of this movement to elevate both diversity and corporate governance in Japan.
Okay, wonderful. Well, thank you so much for joining us on our first Extel podcast out of Japan. And we look forward to seeing you probably in Japan very soon. Thank you for joining today.
Thank you so much, and congratulations on your rebranding.
Thank you.